Hello, everyone. We're here today with Victoria Smith to talk about her incredible new book, Hags. Thank you very much for coming, Victoria. It's wonderful to see you. Okay, so I've just been sitting in my heart, making like extra little notes on this. This reminds me quite a lot of conversations that we've had over the last 10 years or so in relationship to the whole sex erasure issue and how that relates to the relationship between feminist waves and like mothers and daughters and all of this kind of stuff. But one of the things that really struck me powerfully about this book is that it's a kind of love letter to femaleness, and there's a kind of it sort of centrally turns, it feels to me, about this relationship or this kind of conversation that you're having with your younger self, or that your younger self is having with yourself now, and how that relates to your own sense of your relationship with your body and your own femaleness. So I was wondering if you could start by maybe talking a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very much so. As I said, when I was writing it, I felt very much kind of aware of this sort of younger self, and what would I have thought of it, and what would I have said to her, and this, and it's all. I think a problem with writing about feminism and writing about any group of women, like women is such a diverse group, I did have a bit of an anxiety about how much of this is just me, like, you know, how much is so based in my personal experience rather than the experience of women, but as a sex class. You know, and because I know that certainly I had quite a lot of issues when I was younger about femaleness, about my body, about developing and growing, you know, particularly as expressing itself through anorexia in my case, but also fear of kind of ending up in the same position as my own mother, as other women her age, and how this all kind of, the way it got bound up in my head was kind of, when I was younger, it was this perception of feminism as offering me a route out of being stuck in that rut of ending up being like those middle-aged women, ending up like them, and this kind, it's almost like seeing it in the same way as I saw kind of starving myself and not wanting to grow. It was like, I'm not going to follow that route, I'm not going to get trapped, I'm not going to fall into that. And I very much associated being trapped with being female, and I see this such a lot now, particularly with gender identity, and the way in which you know, many younger women, or whether they identify as women or not, are fearful of becoming older women, and are fearful of becoming trapped, and are fearful of that kind of identity, and it becomes so tied up with femaleness. And you don't see it as a kind of self-hatred, you see it as a kind of seeking liberation, you see it as trying to free yourself, but there's always a bit of yourself that knows that you are female and you are getting older, and you are going to move through time as a woman in the way that all of us move through time as human beings. And I think it's, you know, I've seen quite a lot of lashing out against older women, because that's actually more kind of an internalized, it's a real fear of the self and of the body.
I think this comes through really clearly, and I think, coming back to what you were saying about your own experience, I don't think you are. I think it might be that because of your experience of anorexia, you have a particularly heightened awareness of how that not wanting to get old and kind of dissociation from the body and dissociation with femaleness was kind of tied up together. But I don't think it's a unique experience of women as a class. I think, and like, you know, the parallels that people have drawn between that kind of desire to dissociate from the body that we see in trans identification in young girls, and the desire to dissociate from the body that we see in eating disorders in young women, and how it's to do with wanting to kind of disavow some place that they feel like they're being forced into by virtue of their femaleness, and then the responsibility gets placed on the femaleness. And then you end up in this, and it's also because, like you say, the femaleness in itself has already been made to stand for something in relationship to the human, right?
Yeah.
So I think you're really good on the way in which this relates to the concept of the male default as well. And there's something to do with what's going on with feminism in terms of whether we understand feminism as something that's about trying to identify with the male default and thinking that we're going to be able to liberate ourselves, and how much feminism is actually about understanding that the male default is part of the structure of oppression.
Yeah, and it's like in the second sex, it's sort of both our rights about this idea that it's sort of like men don't have bodies, you know,
right?
They're just like, they just are, and women are the other. Women are the ones who have bodies. And it seems to me so much that this kind of like rejection of the body or seeking to transcend the female body is this like drawing towards the male default in a way that we'll be like that, we'll be free like them because they don't have bodies and we won't either. And
right.
But men have bodies too.
Men have bodies too.
This entire system that's set up to kind of treat women's bodies as the problem.
Right. And then we end up, because of the structure of the male default, because I think you're very good in this, I think it's in the Dirty Hags chapter where you're talking about housework and dependency. And there's a lot in that about how what's actually going on is also just a kind of heaping of all of the animal life work, mortality, dirty stuff that is the work that maintains all the life, but that no one wants to take responsibility for, and men particularly don't want to deal with because it undermines their little god fantasies, and that all gets like heaped onto women. And so like it's your job to carry all the animality and all the dependency and all the dirtiness, and that kind of is, so you get the bodies, we don't have the bodies, you get the bodies and the animal stuff, and you have to do all of that. And then we're like, you have bodies too, guys, you're just pretending that you're not by making us the bodies so that you think you can wander around being these little brain on stick little god creatures.
And then it's getting all tied up with these ideas of gender critical feminists are just conservatives, they're just domestic, they just want to keep people tied in these relationships of dependency. You know, there's a real confusion going on about the fact that dependency and bodies, they're fundamental to just being human. That, you know, it's not about like being some housewife in a particular role, but it's this kind of, it's this kind of rejection of mummy, is this kind of rejection of it's seen as rejecting traditionalist, conservative, right-wing ideas about what women are, because it's all got conflated together. And this
right, it has all got conflated together. And then when we try and talk about who does reproductive labor and how that reproductive labor gets organized, we can't have that conversation without people going, oh, you want us all to be like stay-at-home mums?
Yeah.
And we're like, well, if you want to stay at home, then we would like you to be able to do that without losing your humanity. And if you don't want to stay at home, we would like you to be able to do that too.
Yeah.
What we would like is for it to be okay for you to be female and for us to organize the world so that that doesn't constrict your human possibilities.
Yeah.
If anyone can imagine that you can be female and human, and we might organize the world in that way. But that never seems to be a possibility for either anyone on the kind of progressive right side of history left, or for a lot of the people who are reacting against it on the right. And then it's like, oh, well, no, we just need to accept that and this is interesting with relation to the Mary Harrington, I think we talked about that a little bit. She kind of goes, oh, well, the male default doesn't work for women. And we're like, yeah, that's right. The male default doesn't work for women. We've been saying that for the last older feminist women have been saying that for a long time, but liberal progressive feminism never hears us. And then you take liberal progressive feminism, which is actually the one that believes in the male default. It's like the young woman's feminism that's like, we can be free of our bodies, and anyone that tells us that we're female is trying to oppress us.
Yeah.
And then on the other side, they go, well, the male default doesn't work for women, so like back to the patriarchal family then.
Yeah. And I definitely felt that really strongly when I was younger, this kind of like, yeah, that I will sort of disidentify so strongly from this like conservative patriarchal idea of women as just born to be breeders, kind of born to kind of just do all this care work. And this idea that, oh, you know, it's so focused on the body, it doesn't recognize the mind, and it doesn't recognize that women need economic independence in order to be free. Yeah,
Right.
these are huge pressures. It's, you know, and it is very oppressive, that kind of norm. So I felt very much like I'm just going to kind of disidentify from all this and kind of, you know, be freed from that. Almost like you can think yourself free from it and it won't matter,
Right.
but your body's still there all the time.
Right. And I
And it's
think,
also, dependency isn't a horrible thing. It's made into a horrible thing by certain structures, and the way that
right.
it's all heaped onto women, and the way that instead of understanding ourselves as all a mix of givers and takers and all being dependent, there are all these false ideas that women must give and give and give, and
Right.
this completely false idea that men are somehow independent and free and not completely reliant on women and women's bodies, and actually quite scared by
Right.
it.
Right. And I think you and me share a kind of similar intuition about this, that fear of the dependency is the thing that's actually underneath the whole, because the whole structure looks like a massive exercise in like disavow. Yeah. Like, I don't have a body, I'm not dependent. You're very good on this about the relationship between change as well. The importance of the female life cycle as being this thing that changes through time, and how this is kind of, that's a fundamental fact, right? About all
Yeah,
creatures that have bodies. There's something about female embodiment that makes it more difficult for women to con themselves into this I'm a little disembodied God creature idea that we're given of the human over the course of the female life cycle, because of the nature of our reproductive capacities. And generally when we get pregnant or we have children, it becomes particularly difficult to deny that we're embodied in certain kinds of ways, whereas men seem to be better at conning themselves for longer and possibly the whole of their lives that they are actually these little brains on sticks.
and it's there in those really misogynistic texts on misogyny from sorry, not on misogyny, on the menopause from the 60s that I sort of quoted a bit in the book.
Right.
That this idea that I think Robert Wilson says, men continue in smooth continuity, whereas women's femininity crumbles in ruins when she hits menopause. It's this idea that kind of men just carry on being men all their lives,
Right.
but women have this real decline narrative because suddenly like they lose their fertility and like, or they lose their femininity, however that's being defined. And it's kind of, oh, they, you know, they're just faulty and flawed because they don't stay the same throughout their lives.
Right. And I think, again, this really comes back. It comes through, like, it's a very clever way of unpicking this, right? Because there's so much in that little, like, autonomous, independent, invulnerable, godlike little kind of construction of the human that is like the male default, that is really about the denial of mortality, right? And I think you're very good on this. And the relationship between change and mortality is very, in the kind of Western Christian tradition or whatever Abrahamic tradition, it's all just like, yes, well, we have God and it is eternal and nothing changes. And you get this a lot as well when you look at like early Greek philosophy, like this absolute horror about change, right? We must make ourselves completely invulnerable and immortal and eternal, and we must deny that there is any change whatsoever and everything is always the same. And it's just like, no, it's not. That's death.
Yes.
Like, there's this weird thing where it's like that construction is so obsessed with holding on to life that it like denies the thing that makes things alive and sort of ends up turning itself into death, right?
And makes women responsible for death because
or makes
like,
women right,
they give birth to you and they give birth to you as mortals, and it's just
right. And then you have all of this weird gaping chasmy stuff that gets projected onto us because we're like, oh, you produce the void, and it's like, well, we're sorry that the death was trailing along with the life
Yeah,
that we gave you. There's not much
part of
we
the
can do.
deal.
It's kind of can't do much about that. Sorry. How dare you produce us not as little gods? Like, all right, guys, would you rather you weren't born? Is that what's happening? No, I think that's really interesting. And there's something, I've thought about this a lot in terms of our relationship to embodiment, and I've also thought about it and like the disavowal of the embodiment and how that's to do with this male default thing. And I've also thought quite a lot about the breaking of generational knowledge between older women and younger women, and particularly between mothers and daughters. And Irigaray talks about this a lot. She talks a lot about like female genealogy and maternal genealogy. I had never quite put those two things together. I knew that they went together, but I didn't quite understand how they went together. And I think you've done a really good job of explaining what there is. There's a couple of things that I'd like to read you, because there's one place where you put this. Teaching young women not to trust their own bodies goes hand in hand with teaching them not to trust older women. Can you unpack that a little bit?
I think it's not trusting your own body is so linked to sort of not trusting what you will become, which is the older woman. And it's this kind of, it's just the epitome of internalized misogyny. It's this kind of,
like, because you want to imagine when you're young, you want to imagine that you will be able to stay in this eternal state of youth.
And it's this state of fear that you're in that's projected onto older women, because you don't want to end up like that. There's a quote in the book from Jane Shilling when she's describing like being a teenager, looking at her mother and thinking like, I won't end up like that. I wouldn't be able to breathe if I end up like that. And then there's Adrienne Rich, like just saying, I thought about my mother and I thought I'll do it differently. I won't end up. And that sort of feeling that I won't end up like that is so common, and it's so linked, I think, to this knowledge that you are female and this antipathy that you can have towards your own femaleness. Because
do we think it's because, this is what I'm interested in, right? Because a lot of what I've been thinking about recently is to do with like matrilineal societies and matrilocal societies and how they different, like whether we can understand patriarchy first and foremost as a kinship structure, right? As a change from social groupings which were principally organized around women, in which men came in and left, and then a shift to a family that was structured around the male line, in which females come in from other groups and are isolated from other women and also actually other men who have their backs, and how this is to do with women being separated or not identifying with older women, and how much of that is to do with in cultures in the set of social arrangements that we use now. When we look at what is happening to older women, we're like, we feel like this overwhelming sense of like being like some kind of claustrophobic, being crushed by some closure of possibility or something like that. Is it just that we see that these women are older and that there's some horror in them being older, maybe from a patriarchal beauty standard kind of place that you're also very good at thinking about? But is it also that there's something because my sense of it when I was younger was that there was something suffocating about it. Like I felt almost like there'd been this kind of claustrophobia, like there's no room for maneuver kind of feeling.
In terms of why you don't want to kind of associate with them.
Yeah, like when we look at older women and we think, or we look at our mothers and we think we don't want that to happen to us, somehow I'm going to be able to escape that. What is it that we're seeing in their experience that is filling us with this desire to make us escape, like, and whether it's just to do with them being in older bodies, or whether it's to do with something about how their lives end up being organized, or something like that, that makes us feel this kind of like like what's that coming from?
I think it's to do with a lot with how their lives are organized, but it gets kind of projected onto the body,
Right.
because you know that you can't stop yourself growing and being female and getting older, but you can be really terrified that the fact that you were born female means you're kind of destined to end up getting sort of crushed and locked in this way.
Right. Because that's what I was saying. There's some sense of like restriction, or like claustrophobia, or like the thing that we're trying to escape from, and then we project that onto the body, like it's the body that's crushing us, or it's the femaleness that's crushing us. And what I'm wondering is whether it's actually something about the isolation or restriction that is experienced by women going through a female life cycle in these sets of conditions that kind of isolates them, or heaps everything onto them, or means that they're separated from other women in a way that isn't actually being produced by their bodies. It's being produced by how their life cycle is intersecting with the way we happen to organize things.
I think it's kind of both.
Right.
But I think as well, I mean, at each stage, there's so many different pressures you're dealing with, and so much pressure on you to sort of separate from women of different generations. You know, there's the way in which at certain stages of your life, it can be advantageous to align yourself with the men in your peer group rather than the women of different generations.
Right.
And that's, you know, it's not just like being really selfish. It can be a real safety thing, and it can be a real kind of just wanting to protect yourself and wanting, but there's also that feeling, if I do this, then I will kind of beat the system and I won't end up following the same route. And
yeah, I mean, there's some sense that, I mean, I think, yeah, there's some sense, which you talk about a lot, that each generation comes along, thinks that they have some magic bullet that means they're going to not become their mothers, right? And that the reason why feminism failed is because the last generation fucked up somehow and became their mothers and didn't realize. But this generation are different, and we're going to work it, like, not even we're going to work it out. We've just realized that we're going to identify our way out of this femaleness, and therefore we're going to escape this fate, and then the job will be done.
Yeah, and it's kind of amazing how explicit it's become. You know, just this kind of, I can't remember what the account's called. It's not Sisters Uncut, it's another one, but it was kind of saying that if there weren't women wouldn't be oppressed, basically.
Oh yes, yeah. No, I know that.
I mean, that's kind of like the end point of it. Like,
if they've been trolling us all for about the last however long. You all need to read Wittig. Wittig says that women don't exist, and we're like, yes, we know. We think she's talking shit. Like, radical feminism is a big tradition. Not everyone agrees. Like, if we agreed with everyone, we wouldn't have a coherent position. So we've had to look at it all and then decide which bits seem to make sense to us, right? I mean, I think this I identified very strongly with, right? This idea, I remember, and it's also like a male approval thing, right? You know that if you exhibit disidentification with other women and or with feminism when you're a young woman, that will get you male approval, right?
Yeah.
I have a very clear memory of sitting on a bed in a party somewhere when I was 19, basically being like, oh, well, you know, second wave feminism, they did some very important things. We're so grateful, but, you know, it's all sorted. We don't need any of that now. And just feeling this little frisson of like how edgy and I was.
Yeah, it's almost feeling like, oh, they've got all the rights for us. And now that we've got all these rights, we're going to use them to become better people than they were, kind of, you know, because they were too oppressed to be full human beings. But now, you know, we are this golden generation of women who are going to kind of achieve full personhood like
And
men.
achieve full personhood like men, and that's the trick. No one understood before.
Yeah,
We just had to identify with men.
yeah,
And we're like, I think people have been doing that for a few hundred years. It
yeah.
doesn't seem to work out that well.
And I've got this memory, like, I mean, when I was growing up, it was very much, I came from a middle class background in which, there was status attached to having a wife who didn't work. Even in the 80s, there was this kind of like, and one thing I think that increasingly, I mean, it gets lost, I think, in some of the kind of now reactionary feminists who are now saying like, oh, look what's happened with liberal feminism, we need to go back to marriage, we need to go back to complementary roles. Like, not having your own economic independence, even if you're not starving, is a really big deal for women. It makes you really unsafe,
Right.
and it really affects your status in relation to other people in the household. And I can remember even from a really young age just feeling like, I won't let that happen to me, I'm not going to be dependent. And I can remember looking at my mum, like, she used to do voluntary work at school, like, used to be like tidying the library or something. And I can remember looking at her and a bunch of other middle class women who came in once a week to do this and thinking, but they don't get any money for this. This is stupid. That'll never happen to me. And and basically I wasn't thinking, oh, this is a really unfair system in which like certain voluntary care work gets loaded onto women and men aren't expected to join. I can remember I looked down on those women and thought they were maybe a bit stupid for doing this. And
Right.
I didn't judge the men, I judged the women, because I was so frightened. And this is even at primary school, just like this sense that I'm not gonna be like that.
I think this repeats itself over and over
Yeah.
again, right? Like, anyone who actually ends up sucking it up and doing that work must be some kind of idiot.
Yeah.
Right? Rather than understanding not only that work gets heaped onto women, but that work is the most important work that's being done in the entire society. That it's actually, it's like the thing that happened during COVID, where everyone suddenly went, oh, did you realize, like, all the people we think doing like shit jobs that we have no respect for, they're keeping the whole country running all the time.
They're the essential jobs. Yeah.
We're just like, yes, that's right. All the people you have no respect for are the people who are keeping the entire country running.
Yeah.
And it's true. I mean, this is also true, right? With care work and reproductive labor, and I don't know, there was a conversation, they're trialing UBI somewhere, right? And like Sophie Corcoran or one of the terrible right-wing pundits came out and were like, so taking money off grafters and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, well, actually, a lot of the people taking that money will be women who are doing a shit ton of care work, right?
Yeah.
And one of the reasons why UBI is a good idea, I think, is that then it actually, we need to find some way of supporting reproductive labor that isn't directly paying women to do reproductive labor.
Yeah.
Because it's also the work of love, right? So there's something that feels uncomfortable about going, we're going to pay you money directly to love your children. And no one really wants that, right? But at the same time, as you say, women are incredibly vulnerable, in an incredibly vulnerable position doing that work. And they're extremely open to exploitation. And that work needs to be valued in some way, right? And supported. In a way that doesn't, it's like the attitude that is given is like, we're doing women some kind of favor by allowing them to undertake the most important work in the society that keeps the entire thing going, right? And it's just like, they're not on holiday. It's like when women want flexible working, or they want time to go and pick their kids up, it's like, they're not popping off to like, Marbella and like drinking cocktails. They're producing all the people, which you need, and at the same time they're off at the National Conservative Conference going, have more babies, and we're like, work out how to pay for it then.
And yet when we try to talk about this with like the progressive left, it's characterized as kind of it's all a bit mum's net. It's all a bit like associating women with motherhood. Not everyone wants to have children, and like we're not all walking rooms. We're not.
Yeah, and it drives me nuts. And this is the argument. So it's like it's always the same thing, right? We get pincered, right? We on the one side, we've got a bunch of people who are basically being asked to engage. They don't understand this, but they're being asked to engage in like patriarchal body denial, right? Where they take the default male subject and they're like, we're all going to be free and we're going to float off into the clouds. And we're like, okay, and who's going to wipe the asses? And there's that kind of, the transhumanist part of that story as well, right?
And God, there's like, Sophie Lewis even says, like, if we had this like full surrogacy now, so like, some people would just have babies out of curiosity. And maybe some people would wipe asses out of curiosity. It's just like,
sure, right. No, I mean, this is,
it's some things you just do because
well, also this is also the thing, right, about the problem with how women seek, or how as a class we are able to seek justice for that labor, right? Because I think one of the things that you're very good at here and that really helped me is that it is, I've always been aware of this, about how radicalizing mothering is, or motherhood is, for most women, and how that is related to the fact that Mumsnet became like a political nodule in a very significant political movement, and the progressive left came along and were like, you're supposed to be like smushing carrots. What are you doing having political thoughts, mummies?
It really revealed what they think women should be doing the moment they had children. It was like, you're meant to be those middle class women that we just make fun of because all you care about is like whether you've got a bugaboo of the right brand, and it's just kind of, we're trivial, but when we're not trivial, like that's when
then they can't cope with it, right? And it's so indicative. It's like, you haven't managed to work out that there are female human beings, and that they have female bodies, and that they're human beings, and that this is the thing we keep coming back to, like, women are people. Can we stop separating the people bit from the female bit? Like, how long is this going to take? Well, forever, because we decided humans were men, and we just can't think our way out of it. Or experience, like, because like you say, as soon as women have those embodied experiences, they're then of the age that you can dismiss them. Right. And there are some younger women that have that awareness, right? But the instinct to identify with the mind, or with what you're told are the characteristics of the human when you're a young woman, is so strong, right? So that there's this connection between the female life cycle and the reproductive cycle, the political oppression of women, and the way in which women move through the life cycle in a way that means, just as they come to understand how that political mechanism works, they've become people who don't have any voices. Right?
And it's also cumulative, and it's also connected, yet further down that we're being taught to kind of talk about how women experience oppression in completely disjointed ways, like referring to like pregnant people or menstruators or gestators, as though they're these separate people who experience oppression at particular points, and it's actually it's continuous, even if you don't have children yourself, even if you don't go through particular things, even as when I was a young adult, I didn't menstruate because of being ill, but it's like, and this I wasn't one of the menstruate, I was still part of this class, and actually my illness and the fact that it made me not menstruate was a very specifically female experience. They're all specifically female experiences, and yet they're being chopped up into these little things that are meant to like not relate to one another. And if you say actually this all relates, you're called a biological essentialist.
Right. And I mean, it's a very, it's very hard to know how much of this maneuver is coming from internalized misogyny, right? And how much of it is coming, you know, a lot of the narratives at the moment are a lot of the right wing, because there's a lot more right wing narratives coming in at the moment. A lot of the right wing narratives that are coming in at the moment are like, oh, well, this is all feminism's fault because feminism tried to say that men and women were completely identical, you know, in a similar way as kind of Harrington says, well, this is feminism's fault because, you know, feminism sold this progressive narrative about the male default. And then you're like, why is it that young women are in a situation where they're inside a structure that makes them think that the only way they can be free is by disidentifying with their bodies? Like, is that women's fault? Is it women's fault that they're constantly being told that if they want to be free and they want to be treated like human, they have to pretend that they're not female?
Yeah. Well, it's that scene in like Matt Walsh's What is a Woman?
Right.
And you know, it's a pro-choice march, and he's just going up there trolling women, saying like, oh, what's the woman, and going, oh, look, they can't define a woman, it's, you know, aren't they ridiculous? Like, and it's kind of, but these are women who have been told that if they identify women with the body at all, they'll have their abortion rights taken away, and they've been told it by men like Matt Walsh, so they're completely you know. And the left at the same time is like telling them, well, abortion's a matter of like bodily autonomy, and so is like choosing what sex you are. So like, unless you buy into like letting people be whatever sex they say they are, you don't deserve abortion rights. And it's this kind of everyone is telling them that they must choose between knowing that they're female or having reproductive rights. And
or having any self-determination, or being treated as if they're like, you know, a human that gets some degree of control over their existence.
That's not something women independently dreamed up for themselves.
No, like that's what's annoying me. That's what's really upsetting me at the moment, right? Is that, you know, maybe feminism and women are always being pincered, but because of the nature of the way in which trans ideology has caused the left to go into this very extreme kind of bodily denial mechanism that you document very well in the book, it now just feels like we're completely pincered, right? And there's almost no space for women saying, can we be female and human? Can we talk about where this male default thing came from and whose interests it's actually serving? Why are we being blamed for it? Why can we not have compassion? Like, we can have compassion for the fact that young women are wanting to identify out of their sex, right? It's very obvious why that would be an option. Many of the feminist women who ended up in this battle because we identified with that experience, right? Because we recognized that if someone had come along when we were 17, 18 or 19 and said, hey, you want to be a human being? Right, we'll get rid of your body. There you go, bingo. We would have gone for it, right? We understand why that's so attractive. And it's taken us like a long time to come to inhabit our femaleness and own it. And then we can't pass that. And then we're in this very frustrating situation where we can't pass that on to younger women because they can't hear us, because they won't hear us, because we're witches.
And I can even sometimes feel it myself, particularly with stuff to do with like breast binding and elective mastectomies. You know, it's kind of, when you see people sort of so getting behind this message that you know, some people have inner selves that just aren't compatible with having breasts, you know. And I think
this is the thing with the casualty.
I was thinking that with the casualty thing, I was thinking for so long I felt I don't, you know, that's not compatible with how I feel inside. And there's still, you know, when that message is out there, there's still a bit of me that thinks, well, I don't, you know, I'm not, you know. I can remember sort of just coming out of anorexia in my early 20s, feeling absolutely mortified that my real self had been like sort of transformed into something that looked like this kind of carry-on figure. It was just like, this isn't me at all. And I remember sort of even feeling I've got to like, I've got to match, my inner self's got to match this body, that almost like it made me try and change my personality to kind of become more kind of promiscuous and more kind of feminine, to kind of justify not looking like how I felt inside anymore.
Right.
And it's so complicated, but these things, they're not feelings that we're born with. They're this idea that some people have this kind of innate selfness that doesn't match having tits, and this is completely unrelated to a completely pornified society, and it's completely unrelated to just the general way in which girls are treated from puberty onwards. It's mental.
Right. And I don't see, without this social structure, I don't see any reason why women would experience themselves this way at all.
No.
Right. If you think about, the anthropological record and the idea that there were societies in which there was matrilocality, in which young women were being raised in family groups in which they were close to 3 generations of women, right? At least 3 generations of women, possibly 4 generations of women would have been living together, plus males of horizontal generations, plus children, right? So there is no reason, in those societies, women held a lot of political power, they held spiritual power, they were in charge of distributing food resources, right? I don't see why, in a society like that, younger women would have felt horrified about the social position of older female members of their family at all, or would have felt that there was some particular need to try and escape from the fact that they were female. It doesn't make sense to me. Like, that's not an animal thing, right? Everyone's like, oh, it's animal, gender's animal, your brains are wired differently. Even if it is the case that we have natural instincts to look after young because we're female animals, there's no reason why we should have a natural instinct to be horrified by our own femaleness and to try and escape it. Like, that makes no sense.
And it is so, the fact that it is so many more women around adolescence right now in this particular cultural moment, and that actually quite a lot of it maps onto the same people who would have starved themselves in the past, and we don't think, oh, that's just like, although actually you are seeing with anorexia sort of this drive towards kind of making out it's primarily biological, which I don't really think, but
I don't think so.
But there's this kind of like, we don't want to admit that this is something we're doing to women, and I find it particularly maddening when you see men having conversations about like how evil TERFs, they can't just accept non-binary and trans men, like, and what it's their bodies, whatever they want to do with it. It's this kind of, they don't seem to think girls are hurting themselves, and maybe it's the culture that benefits us and the culture in which we dominate that is driving them to do this. They're actually, and it's not that they're even ignoring it, they're actually patting themselves on the backs for not being as mean as we are, for seeing a problem with it. We're being the really terrible people for saying, actually, I think you might be hurting yourself. And it's the same with porn as well, kind of the way that older women who like will say, actually, I don't think this is good for you. I think maybe you're making decisions that, not just porn, I mean, with sexual choices, kind of women who kind of say, I don't think this is freely consenting if you're under all these kind of moral and social pressures, were considered like these terrible people, whereas men who can just accept women doing whatever they want, they think they're the really kind ones.
Yeah, and I think it's because, again, it takes time. This is another thing about the life cycle thing, because it's not only that women go through a physiological set of changes and that those then have certain social effects, which then over time we come to see that this story about how we're completely free and our bodies don't matter and all of this stuff isn't going to be true. But also it takes a certain amount of time to process the trauma of the things that we experienced in our teenage years that then drove us towards that kind of disidentification, right? And to go through some kind of process of reclaiming our femaleness to such a point where we can actually kind of, there's a bit inside it, there's a bit in this where I just find it really moving, actually. It's particularly knowing what you're oops, hold on, sorry. Where you start talking about why you are able to kind of take possession of the fact, let me have a look, of your own femaleness, and that you don't feel shame anymore. And there's something, I think there's this thing about separating us from younger women. It's so much, it always feels so, you know, we always talk about like the zero fucks thing or the giving no fucks thing. But I think that's actually a lot more to do with not being ashamed, right? That something about the desire, because it's so structurally convenient for the system for us to be separated from younger women and to have this structure that continually stops younger women listening to older women, because there's some fear that if younger women and older women have some solidarity with each other, older women might be able to pass some of their not giving their fucks on to younger women, and younger women won't be manipulated as easily into being compliant, because so much of that rests on them feeling terrible about themselves. And there's a bit here where you're like, the reason why I'm prepared to look like one of those ridiculous women who wangs on about reproduction as though it matters, to risk being called a 50s throwback, a maternal revivalist, elitist, ethnocentrist, and worst of all, essentialist, is that I am beyond shame. I can no longer be embarrassed into thinking that having been born female is something to be downplayed or for which I must atone, lest someone mistake me for someone like my mother or her mother, or some random 50s housewives, or whichever woman a woman like me is supposed to be fleeing at this point in time. I'm too old and too compromised, and I want my story, a story that connects with the stories of others just as flawed and compromised as me. It's gorgeous. It's really, really moving. But I think this thing about, it's like somehow I don't get annoyed with the non-binary kids and the this and the that, and it's like, oh, you think you're so special, but actually I just want to be able to give them some kind of mechanism which would immunize them against the shame that's making them flee themselves, you know.
But they're being told that women like us want them dead, basically.
They are.
And it's just, you know, how can you possibly talk? And that is such an extreme way of like getting the division there. It's just like, oh, they pretend to care about you, but actually they're denying your existence. And it's just,
and I think this is also the thing that then upsets me about the, you know, the kind of, you know, the internal ructions that are going on about like our position in relationship to someone like Matt Walsh, right? Because, you know, Matt Walsh doesn't have any understanding of what the set of social conditions are that are making young. He's
just, oh, look at the crazy liberals that aren't, they're every bit as stupid as I always said they were. And it's
right. And when he wants to go and use that kind of attitude and shtick against, like, you know, TRA academics who refuse to answer straightforward questions, then it can be quite effective, right? But when you take that attitude and it becomes just like, oh, look, own the libs, they're just, look at these stupid blue-haired kids, they're all, you know, and there's lots of narratives about, okay, they're so narcissistic and they're so this and they're so that, and like, yes, we can all lose our temper with them and get frustrated, right? But the things that are underpinning it, yes, they are being exacerbated by social media. Yes, they're being exacerbated by technology. Yes, they're being exacerbated by late capitalism. But the fundamental issue about young women's discomfort with their femaleness and the way in which femaleness is being denigrated, right? That's not being produced. That's something that's already there, right?
Yeah, I think the trauma is very real. I think it's getting sort of misrepresented or misdirected. You know, this kind of like, if you don't use the right pronouns, you're literally killing me. There is actually a real trauma underpinning that. That's not to do with the pronouns. It's to do with what you know your position is. And I think it's really, really hard to be an adolescent girl.
Yeah, it's really traumatic. And I think under these conditions of gendering, which have got much, much more extreme since we were young, right? I think something happened between the time that in the 5 or 10 years after we left university, where what the younger generation were being subjected to in terms of the constriction of the gender roles that they were presented with became much more extreme.
Yeah.
I don't know how much of that was just backlash and how much of it was kind of capitalist pinkification or whatever. But we now have a generation of kids who seem completely disconnected from the possibilities of gender nonconformity that we grew up with in the kind of wake of the second wave, and just cannot, conceptualize how it would be possible for them to survive inside this very constricted set of possibilities. And that seems to be true for some of the young males as well. I remember outside that Brighton meeting, the one where we got surrounded in Women's Place, where it was like very scary and we had to like walk through this tiny little tunnel and they were screaming at us. I was with my girlfriend who at the time, and she stopped and she turned around and there was a young trans-identified male there, and he was clearly, to me, perceptibly a young gay man, right?
Yeah.
Very willowy, very tall, kind of beautiful long red hair. He looked fabulous, right? And I just turned around and sort of went, "Oh, darling, you look amazing." So we started talking to him, and he could not. He was very sweet, and I was like, everyone was screaming, and there was like a very extreme atmosphere. And I just looked at him and I said, "Do you think this is helping?" And he was like, "No, I don't think this is helping at all." And I was like, "So what are we going to do about it?" And he was like, "I don't know." And I was like, "Well, do you want to come in and listen to us?" And he said, "Am I allowed in?" And I said, "Yeah, sure." And then he said, "But you think I'm a man?" And I was like, "Well, yes." He's like, "But I'm not. And he was terrified. Like,
Yeah.
it wasn't even aggression. I mean, normally we get a lot of aggression. He just looked terrified by the prospect. And
it's kind of, but he knows he's a man.
He knows he's a man.
Because you wouldn't matter that much if
like in the same way. I mean, this is the thing about the disavow, right? And to come back to what we were saying at the beginning about how the whole structure is based on this default that's about disavowing the body. Men know they have bodies too.
Yeah.
Right? They wouldn't, a lot of the horror, the misogynist horror that's projected onto women and onto like the images of the devouring mother and like all of this stuff is their own knowledge that they're little squishy embodied creatures who are going to die being projected. Like,
yeah. And they're not even creatures who get pregnant, which I think is quite a big deal. And I think that's coming through in this kind of appropriation of female reproduction. And on the one hand, we're told it's this thing that makes us inferior. So if we know what's good for us, we'll just like completely decouple being a woman from being a member of the class who gets pregnant, because you're not some kind of walking uterus. But at the same time, there's this big desire to kind of claim pregnancy and breastfeeding as things that men can do.
Right.
And it's,
yeah, because it was always womb envy, like the whole penis envy thing.
Yeah.
I mean, clearly, I have never met a woman who does not think that penis envy is the most comedy idea they've ever heard in their life.
It's really bizarre because
it's like, what is that?
Yeah.
But what comes through over and over again, there is this double thing, right? There is the fear, or it seems to me there's double thing. There's the fear of the embodiment and the fear of the vulnerability, and at the same time, and the kind of the death spectre that gets projected onto birth, right? And then at the same time, there's just this very clear, like, how dare you have the power of life? This is outrageous, I don't know, Marina was saying this the other day, it's like they just get very angry because it's like we're these inferior creatures and then we can produce life, and it's just like completely unacceptable.
But then the construction of us as inferior is based on the fact that we
well,
can
exactly, it's like
because you can do that, we're going to say you can't do anything else.
Right, it's like circular, right?
Yeah.
We've disavowed all of this and constructed you as inferior because you have this power that we can't cope with, and then because you're inferior and you have this power, we're going to be really enraged. And then it seems to, it's the same way, with the dependency. Like, we're dependent on you, so we're going to pretend that we're not dependent on you.
Yeah.
And then every time we're reminded that we are dependent on you, we're going to go and have a massive narcissistic tantrum about it.
Yeah.
And it's like, how about we all just accepted that we were dependent on each other? And we all accepted that we had bodies, and we all accept that we have these material needs, and we all accept that we're mortal, and you stop projecting that shit onto us, right? And then we work out how to deal with that in an equitable way. But no, that's impossible. And I don't know how we get past that, right? Like, it seems to me, if you think about those kinds of matrilineal cultures or matrilocal cultures where you have generations of women living together, in which I can't understand how you would have this inculcated hatred of femaleness in that context. A lot of the symbolic kind of mythic structures around those cultures focus on the mother, right? They focus on the importance of that bond, but in a way that doesn't exclude the males, like, because the males have a familial social responsibility to creating the context that supports that life-making work as well. They're not excluded from it. So it's almost like women have been isolated in this life-making role and separated, right? And then they're envied for having some kind of control over it, or it being their domain.
Yeah.
It's like,
and it feels like we're really caught at the moment between political extremes that want to use it and appropriate it in different ways. And it's just, and sort of, you have the left at the moment really trying to use abortion particularly as a kind of stick with which to beat women, to get them to go along with denial of the importance of maternity in relation to womanhood overall. This kind of like, if you want your abortion rights, don't be some biological essentialists who think female people matter as a sex class. But the whole reason why abortion is such an important issue is because it's because pregnancy is such a big deal. It's like, it's the whole thing.
Well, and it's the kind of reproductive control, reproductive resource thing.
Yeah.
Right. The reason why it matters as a sex class and we're in this position as a sex class is because you're using us as a resource, right?
Yeah.
That's why it matters that young women and all women across that lifespan have some political solidarity together, because actually their entire political position is being structured by a set of mechanisms that are about controlling and appropriating our bodies in certain ways, right? So there's like, if you feed young women a lie that their bodies have got nothing to do with it, you're just setting them up to walk straight into it, right? Which is actually what's happening, right?
Yeah.
And then your abortion rights are a necessary feature of that, because they're the thing that allows you to resist and to have some self-determination about this part of your oppression, right? And this is going on both sides, right? This is going on both sides, right? On the one side, we've got the right wing who are like, well, we will recognize that you're female and that's important, but if you do that, we're going to take your abortion rights away. And we've got the left going, if you want your abortion rights, you have to pretend you're not female. And I'm like, how about we can understand that we're female, that we're a reproductively appropriated class, and that's why our reproductive rights matter. And also why it matters that we organize how we do reproduction when women do choose to have children in a way that doesn't make them vulnerable, doesn't make them isolated. Like, many women want to have children. It's important, you know, I'm not going to, you know, irrespective of what the libtard character, like the right-wing caricature is, that I don't think that, you know, women's desire to have children is entirely manufactured, right? I don't think any feminist is seriously going to argue that these days. But I do believe that women should be able to have children in a way that doesn't make them like poor, vulnerable to male control, vulnerable to male violence, isolated, depressed, like, which is what a lot of women experience. And like, they experience some complete loss of themselves in relationship to like adult social life or the public world or whatever. And that doesn't need to happen. That's not an inherent feature of having babies, right? Sorry.
You have like sort of the right, or kind of what's trying to sell itself now as a kind of feminist right, saying, oh well, if you have marriage, that sorts it out. It's just because we've moved away from marriage, you'll have all this care and all this like compassion and all this kind of nurturing if we just go back to marriage. But it's like there was a reason that women found that it wasn't working for them, and that they weren't being supported, and it's not a recognition of dependence. You know, what was it, Danny Kruger like saying, oh, like, it's not all about you, it's, you know, don't be so selfish, you know, you've got to stay together. And it's just the way that marriage is constructed by the right doesn't cater to this idea of dependency in a really reciprocal way at all. It's still dependency denial.
It's still, I mean, like we say, both sides are still using the male default. Women is the repository of care and dependency and social fabric and maintaining all of this stuff, right? So the way the right are using it and the reactionary feminist kind of side are using it are like, oh, all of this liberal autonomy stuff doesn't work because it's dependency denial. And we're like, yeah, we agree with you about that. Liberal autonomy is a bad model for women, right? It's actually a bad model for men too. You don't seem to think that. You seem to think that liberal autonomy in the public sphere being structured on the male default is fine for everyone. It's not. The earth's dying. It's not working for anyone, right? But then, oh yes, well, so we, you know, it's women's job then to do the job of picking up all the dependency work. And like, actually under the current structure and what's going on with the national conservatism thing, it's like, oh, it's actually women's job to do the work of repairing all of our ravaged social fabric and like go back and sacrifice all of their human self-determination and self-actualization to somehow repair the damage that's been done by late capitalism. And I'm like, oh great, so not only do we have to make all the human beings, we have to repair the fact that you've completely destroyed our social fabric by pretending everyone's little atoms. How about we all realize that we're not little atoms and start from that principle and then work out how to make a world that works for people, right? Because that will work better for everyone. It will work better for women. It will also work better for children, because this whole idea, you know, it's like in Mary Harrington's book where she keeps going, she has these little caveats. Marriage is quite good as long as you get on well with your partner and they treat you with respect and you have enough money. And you're like,
that's quite
that's a pretty big caveat.
It's a big caveat, but it's also, even then, if you do not have some degree of economic autonomy, you're still profoundly vulnerable in a way that your partner isn't.
And that's where we need to, that's where the rubber really meets the road, right? And where we have this story about what the relationship is between sort of a set of physical limits and how we socially organize. And yes, women are vulnerable when they have small children. Does that mean that their having small children must become a site where they are exploited or victims to male violence, and we just have to accept that as some inherent part of child rearing? Or are there ways that we can organize that so that women are able to give their care and attention to raising infants when they choose to do that, but there's also some system where they're being cared for and supported and they're not being exploited or subject to control or subject to violence? And that doesn't seem to be a question anyone wants to
No, it's
deal
the
with.
kind of thing that Rich was trying to imagine already in Of Woman Born, and yet it's kind of just got lost.
It's just got lost. Well, like you say, it keeps getting because the nature of the relationship between the older and the younger generations keeps getting structured by this disavow. You know, it's like we're all dealing with this story now that feminism never cared about women having children, and we only ever wanted women to be career girls. And it's like, we've been thinking about this for 50 years.
Yeah.
And no one ever wants to actually have the conversation.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't really do much feminism at all as a graduate, but I did remember writing an essay about Julia Kristeva and Christa Wolf, and I included something about second wave feminism never really addressed the topic of motherhood, and it's just like, because I'd know about it if they had, and nobody pulled me up on it. It's like nobody said that's a load of rubbish.
Yeah, I think that's a good.
But I kind of my image was just that, like, it was kind of the stuff you get that Susan Faludi's writing about in Backlash. It's just like, oh well, it's all about like shoulder padded women being liberated to go to the workplace, and instead of like being obliged to like care for children at home. And it's just this complete, the whole mommy wars thing that like was pushed in the mainstream press, that it's like this battle between career women and women who love their children. I kind of really bought into the idea that was kind of how it was, but you know, I wasn't one of these women who would get like screwed over by the Daily Mail telling me like I was a bad person if I didn't want to be at home with children. Yeah, and it's I didn't know anything about what women had actually been writing.
And we still don't. It's 30 years later, and we're still having exactly the same conversation.
Yeah.
Like, feminism is just boss girl stuff. Yeah. That doesn't work for women. Like, and we're just like, we've been talking about this for the last 50 or 60 years. We understand that women having children is a really, really, is like the core part of the story. And it keeps getting erased, and it keeps getting erased, and it keeps getting erased. And then women become mothers, and they start going, hang on a minute. And then everyone's like, we can't hear you.
Yeah.
Over and over.
Could you just keep talking about like baby food and nappies on Mum's Net, and we'll get on with the politics?
Right. Because never will motherhood and politics ever come together unless it comes together in this conservative barefoot in the kitchen frame. There's no other way of bringing together the idea of feminism and the idea of women's humanity with the idea of motherhood. Because because it's such a radical demand, we want you to restructure the world so that women can be mothers and human at the same time. And everyone's like, no, don't say that. Right. And so it goes on and on and on and on. And it's incredibly frustrating.
Yes.
Should we stop?
I have to pick up my children actually in 10 minutes.
Well, that's a good place to stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's a really, really wonderful book.
Thank you.
And you write like a dream. You always have. But I'm so pleased. I'm so pleased to have it all in one place.